As we will study the Sirah, we are struck by the seeming endless love that the Prophet ﷺ had for his people. But we rarely have a narration of him in which he is telling anyone, shame on you, what you're doing is wrong, among his followers. And in fact, as we will see, that time and time again, the hardliners see him as too soft. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa subhanallah al-Ali al-Azim. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي يا رب العالمين. Well, inshallah, we begin this journey with the Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ, which is really a continuation of Project Illumine. Project Illumine, where we went through the Quran. And anyone that has engaged Project Illumine would know that throughout the Quran, Allah speaks to the Prophet ﷺ. And although the intended audience are humanity at large, and quite often Muslims in particular, but the medium is so often a discourse between God, a revelation from God to the Prophet ﷺ. And so often the Quran addresses perennial problems, timeless issues. But the launching point is the particular context of the Prophet and his life and the events that he encounters in his life. So the Sirah is really closing the circle on Project Illumine, because as we will see, we are looking at the other side of the equation, where we are often doing so, looking at the life of the Prophet ﷺ through the prism of the Quran. So we go back, as we will see quite often, to look at what the Quran is saying about this man or the events that this man encounters, and the ummah that followed and embraced the Prophet ﷺ. So to get the most from this, those who will get the most are those who anchor themselves in the tafsir and then follow it with these halaqas on the Sirah, inshallah. So when we start this journey, there's always the question of where you start from. And there are, of course, questions of methodology. What methodology do you adopt? Because they, like all historical figures, one, it is important to keep in mind to fully embrace the idea that we always know about the past because someone told us. Anything that has happened in history, it is related to us through the medium of narrations, whether these narrations come in the form of someone writing a book saying this or that happened in the past, or some archival material that we uncover in which someone documents things that happened in the past. We often forget this because we often think that there is some magical medium that reveals history to us. Well, there isn't. The history is known to us because of the medium of human transmission. We are told about what happened in the past always through the medium of human narration. And historical analysis, which is what is done whether consciously or subconsciously all the time by all human beings, all people are constantly in a dynamic of assessing the narrations about the past, whether one embraces some narrations and augments them, even exaggerates them, legitimating these narrations, authenticating these narrations, while excluding others. And this is done by all human beings in relation to history all the time. So there is nothing new when we assess what we choose to legitimate, what we choose to adopt, what we choose to authenticate, and what, for analytical reasons, whatever these analytical reasons are, we say is incredulous or is inconsistent or is less believable for whatever reasons, that there is nothing new about this. This is what the way that human beings relate to history and interact with history all the time. And absolutely, whether you are talking about ancient history, whether you are talking about the history of historical figures that became of great religious significance, like Jesus or Moses, or you are talking about even medieval history or history that is relatively what we refer to as modern, meaning that it is within the past couple hundred years, there is no society, there is no social unit that does not engage in the evaluation of narratives. So even if you take relatively recent history like World War II, what events and from what angle and what you understand about World War, even something as near as recent as World War II, or something as recent as the American invasion of Iraq. You are always relying on the medium of human narrations, whether these narrations are oral, so somehow we recorded the actual spoken transmission, or some form of archival. Now, as we lay the foundations for this journey, it is also critical to remember that any historical figure that has had an impact on the trajectory of human development, the historical narrative is rarely, if ever, just of unidirectional or of a single direction, or smooth and uncomplicated. So, put differently, all historical figures that had had an impact on the trajectory of human development, we find that the narratives surrounding these historical figures are often vested in various interests. And it is not unusual that we find narratives that are conflicting and at odds with one another. So it is not at all unusual to find tensions that the interpreter must resolve. So if we take, for the example of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, we find narratives that a great deal of narratives that have the earmark of exaggeration, that attempt to celebrate him in miraculous ways. So, for instance, narratives that tell us that when he was born, that he was born with a shining light, or that his mother, when she was pregnant with the Prophet ﷺ, saw a light that basically foretold that she is carrying a miraculous baby. At the same time, we find narratives that clearly try to, in one form or another, discredit the Prophet. An example of that are the rather infamous narratives that when he receives the revelation from Jibreel, that he attempts suicide, that he is so troubled by these revelations, or so shaken by being the recipient of the revelation, that he attempts to throw himself off a cliff, and then that an angel saves him from falling off the cliff by carrying him to safety. Now, a narrative like that is intended actually to impeach the Prophet by giving us the impression of someone who is so shaken that he tries to kill himself. And that, again, is not surprising, because history always has this dynamic of narratives and counter narratives that are motivated by a whole span of interests. And it is disingenuous to try to pretend that you are simply objectively, um, um, as Ahl al-Hadith often try to do, simply recording everything. If you want to present an analytical understanding of any historical figure, you must do the hard work of evaluating narratives, incentives for narratives, context of narratives, what dynamics led to certain narratives, and so on. And this is something that quite often I will point to problematic narratives and explain why I choose to consider these narratives unreliable. But again, there is nothing exceptional or unusual about this. Is any honest historian, any honest person who deals with narratives of the past, this is inevitable. And the best method is transparency, that you are simply honest about what you are weighing and what you are assessing in terms of credibility and so on. Okay, so we'll come back, inshallah, to this issue as we, in fact, wrestle with various narratives as we go along. But there is, from an Islamic point of view, we must raise the question, why even study the life of the Prophet at all? Who was this man? And what are we accomplishing by focusing on his life? Because what significance, what role, what value are we engaging when we focus? Now, I would the word is escaping me, but it's not claim, it's not the word I'm looking for. But I would proffer to you, and proffer is a fancy word, but it's that your iman as a Muslim is not complete and cannot be complete unless you learn to love the Prophet ﷺ. But how do you love someone that you don't know? And this is where the importance of actually knowing in a real sense of who this man was. Anyone that deals with Sirah is one thing that you cannot escape from or avoid or fail to notice, is that the miraculous achievement of the Prophet ﷺ of bringing tribal people united under one banner, bringing these divergent loyalties, overcoming loyalties that have been anchored in centuries of tradition. The map of Arabia is a thoroughly tribal map. We know from the wars that were fought and the feuds between tribes in Arabia that were fought. Some feuds would go on for 70 years. And 70 years of feuding between tribes and bloodshed between tribes over what to us, from our perspective, seems like a silly matter, like who won a horse race. And this is actually a real war, which a dispute over who won a horse race. It goes to arbitration, and then one tribe refuses to accept the results of the arbitration, and the war continues between these two tribes for 30 years. Or a dispute over what quite often happens: someone murders another person because of a historical feud, and that results in warfare between tribes for 7 years. An event known as Harb al-Fujjar, which we'll mention or come back to briefly in a little bit. But anyone that studies the context of Arabia would be struck by the fact that this is a context of the entire Hijaz and beyond the Hijaz, beyond the area that is known as the Hijaz in Arabia, but extending to what is Najd and this entire area that we call Arabia, is that for centuries, loyalties are commitments, and commitments are defined tribally. And your lineage is far more important than anything else. And that tribal commitments are so strong and so deep that, unlike Yemen, for instance, or unlike Iraq, or unlike Sham, Palestine, and Syria, Lebanon today, there is a consistent failure for any kingdom to dominate and unify these divergent tribes under a single banner. So so that poses the question. You then are confronted by a fascinating historical issue. What was the nature of the bond offered by the Prophet ﷺ that united all these people under a single banner, definitely under his lifetime? But even with and civil wars in tribal context like this, what would be truly surprising is if a civil war did not happen. But what is truly surprising is that despite of the civil wars after the death of the Prophet, there remained enough of a bond for a civilization and an empire to be born. So if you take the perspective of a historian and you say, I want to understand the historical phenomena. Now, normally when we evaluate the birth of kingdoms, right, what we look at are the movement of trade, the movement of merchandise, material interests in agriculture, material interests in shipping lanes and commerce. And then we say, okay, well, these people came together, these people united because of the following material interests, because of trade, because of the movement of merchandise, but when we see centuries of tradition of feuding between these tribes overcome, and we actually do not find an explanation by new trade routes or by new shipping routes. So in other words, a material explanation is absent. And we find that what actually united these people, and this is the thing that you pause at and you must reflect on, is that what united these folks is the persona of the Prophet ﷺ. So who was this man? Because if anyone that studies even the most superficial engagement with the Sirah, the thing you are struck by is the loyalty and the love and the dedication of the followers of the Prophet ﷺ to him. What we refer to as the companions. It is a so pervasive that even those the narrations that were born through those who converted to Islam quite late and were indeed enemies to Islam and tried to disseminate traditions that impeach the credibility of Islam rather than bolster the credibility, because we this was a real phenomena, and we will talk about it, inshallah. But even those who did that could not undermine or in any way challenge the widespread sociological phenomena of how widely loved this man was. And the Quran itself gives us various remarks on that in various ways that deserve pause and deserve reflection. So, for instance, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ حَرِيصٌ عَلَيْكُمْ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ رَؤُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ. I'll translate it. This is in Surah Al-Tawbah. Or لَقَدْ مَنَّ اللَّهُ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ بَعَثَ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِّنْ أَنفُسِهِمْ يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. Or هو الذي this one was from Surah Al-Imran. Or هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. This is in Surah Al-Jumu'ah. These verses in which Allah reminds Muslims and says, this prophet that God sent was from your midst, one of you, حريص عليكم or حريص عليهم, means someone who is constantly engaged. Al-hirs is to take care of something very carefully. So when Allah says this prophet is harisun alaykum, that what all he worries about, all that burdens him, is your best interest. And then describes this prophet, this man, that he is Ra'uf, Rahim, compassionate and constantly merciful. And then goes on and says, teaching you the book and teaching you wisdom. So it is constant references that we find in God's revealed book that the nature of this man is that he is one of your midst. He is just like you, but what is in his heart and in his mind is constant concern for you and constant compassion and constant mercy. And when as we will study the Sirah, we are struck by the seeming endless love that the Prophet ﷺ had for his people. We see it in so many examples, so many narrations, so many contexts. What is truly remarkable that he does not at all resemble heroic builders of kingdoms in history. He does not resemble any of the historical figures that have built empires. How do you build a kingdom, a polity? Because it wasn't a kingdom, but it was, let's say, a polity. How do you build an ummah? How do you build a polity when you know that part of the character of the Prophet ﷺ is that he would never directly command or order or chide or berate or blame? Pause at this. So he talks about what is halal and haram, but we rarely have a narration of him in which he is telling anyone, shame on you, what you're doing is wrong, among his followers. And his methodology is always so gentle, so tender, as we will see in numerous examples, that time and time again, And in fact, as we will see, and as if you went through the tafsir, you will remember this, that time and time again, the hardliners see him as too soft. Time and time again, when it comes to making choices, and we'll talk about, because there's so much in the Sirah that needs an analytical understanding. Because, so for instance, I don't want to jump ahead or skip ahead, but there are narratives that are clearly unsubstantiated that were circulated, and anyone that would understand the Sirah in a coherent way would see that they were circulated under very suspicious circumstances. Like, for instance, the narratives that after conquering of Mecca, that after granting amnesty to all the people of Mecca, that he executed or allowed the execution of certain individuals. And inshallah, that we'll talk about that, which is completely a farce. I mean, it is, as a narrative, it's completely false, completely unsubstantiated. But we'll get to that. Or even that the so-called the narratives about the executions of the men of certain Jewish tribes after this battle, that battle, but we'll get there, inshallah. This element of that we constantly is constantly evidenced in the tradition of the bond, the love that the followers of the Prophet ﷺ had for him. And his role, now from a theological perspective, his role is shaheed on the ummah, in the same sense that our role as Muslims, and we'll talk about this is that we are bearing witness. The role that the Prophet is obligated to play vis-a-vis his ummah is to bear witness for his ummah, about his ummah. And the numerous traditions that tell us that he plays a never-ending role of intercession and intervention on behalf of his ummah. So if the ummah abandons the Prophet, as so many Muslims indeed have in our modern age, or no longer have the love of the Prophet ﷺ in their heart because they don't know the Prophet. How can you love someone who you don't know? Now, so imagine if you don't have that love, and because you don't have that love, the dynamic that Allah describes in the Quran of someone who is right in our midst, it's like one of us. And one of us meaning we love him, he loves us. And because of that bond, we care for him, but more importantly, he cares for us. And he plays that role of being a source of compassion and mercy for his ummah. And we've broken that covenant because we no longer know him. So that dynamic of compassion and mercy for his ummah is interrupted. you see where I'm going with that, right? Then it becomes a serious issue. Then is he bearing witness for us or against us? When Allah says that you are bearing witness on humanity and the Prophet bears witness on you, but you no longer have a relationship with the Prophet ﷺ because you don't know him, is he bearing witness for us or against us? And that is something that, now, it's something that should be of deep concern for any Muslim. Now, you might ask, well, wait, why do we need to love the Prophet? I mean, isn't it possible that, okay, the people who lived at his time loved him and then he died, and then now all we have is the Quran and that's all we need? Here, we have to go back. There's no way I can answer this question without first dealing with what is this all about? In fact, this existential question of what is our existence all about? Because you are raising an existential question, right? You're saying, well, maybe for my existence, all I need is the Quran. My answer to you is then you don't understand your existence. You don't understand the reason for your existence. Something that often is ignored or not noticed is that Allah from the beginning, before Adam even sins, tells the angels, I am creating a Khalifa on earth. So how is that consistent with the idea of the fall? That Adam and Eve were first in Jannah and then they sin, and because they sin, they go to earth. When Allah says from the very beginning, I am creating someone to inherit the earth.